It takes a very particular type of person that is not only learning the piano, but is willing to send it to someone in order for them to critique it in front of everyone. But that is just the kind of legends that my subscribers are. So let's find out how good they really are at the piano, or what needs fixing. Let's get into it. So first up is Joseph. Joseph played for 8 years between the age of 6 and 14, but he quit because he felt forced to over practice. That is a very common story. He picked it up again about 2 months ago, and he's been hooked practicing for 3+ hours a day. This video is him practicing the ending of Chopin's Nocturne, and he's having trouble with the scalic polyrhythms. Very nice. I love this piece, and I have performed it myself quite a few times. I also love the casual thumbs up at the end. Chopin uses this quite a lot in his nocturnes, where you have these big scales that are quite fast, and they don't seemingly make sense against your left hand. So in this case, you've got 35 notes to fit in, and 4 notes to fit in your left hand, which mathematically doesn't really make any sense. But also, they're kind of not supposed to make sense. The idea is that your right hand is supposed to sound improvised, and therefore the timing can be a little bit more flexible. I know many people, when learning these pieces, try and work out how many notes you've got to play in the right hand against how many notes you've got to play in the left hand. But the problem then becomes that your left hand is kind of conforming to your right hand, rather than your right hand conforming to your left hand. So the problem becomes, and the problem that I heard in Joseph's playing, is that you start by playing one speed, and then when the scale comes in, you end up slowing the left hand down quite a lot to try and fit it in with the right hand, when in reality, because the left hand is the thing that's constant, you want that to stay the same. So there's actually 3 ways that I would practice this in order to make this work. The first way is to slow the left hand down quite a lot, and then pick key notes in the right hand that you're going to fit in with the left hand. So for these scales, usually that's the bottom note and the top note of the scale. You kind of know where you're starting and where you're going to finish, which is there. And roughly speaking, this top note wants to be just before or on that 3rd note in the left hand. So you could do something like this, where you start at the beginning of the bar, giving yourself a run up, but very slowly, and then you play the 1st note and fit this note in with the 3rd note. You also might want to add the 1st note of the next bar, so you're kind of landing in the next bar. Doing that means that you are making sure that your left hand stays at the same speed regardless of the scale. Then after that, the second way that I would practice this is practicing playing from the bottom of the scale to the top of the scale. Because there is a little bit of flexibility in the scale, so you can speed up and slow down and push and pull the scale. It doesn't really matter if you exactly land on that top note with the 3rd note, just before the 3rd note, or just after the 3rd note. The idea is that you're pacing the scale without worrying too much about where they line up together. So you might get something like this. Then you can apply the same logic for the descending part of the scale, and you've essentially got to land on the G sharp with the left hand note in the next bar. But by this point, you've already got the momentum and the speed of the ascending part, so you just have to keep going at the same speed and place the notes together when you get to the bottom. Once you've roughly lined up certain key points in the scale, and you're able to play it at a relatively comfortable speed or slow speed in the left hand, but you're also able to play it in context without changing the speed, then your hand can get really comfortable with the speed you're supposed to be going, and you'll find that your right hand is able to be a little bit more flexible with where you push and pull. The other thing to mention, which I should have probably mentioned first, is that this is an E major scale. It's just starting on an A, so you get C sharps, D sharps, F sharps, and G sharps. So it's actually really worth practicing E major scales in the right hand on their own and slowly increasing the speed so that you're able to play that finger pattern on the piano without much thinking about it. One final thing that I will say to Joseph is to try and maybe move your hand further up the keys when you're playing the scale. The reason for that is because at the moment on the black keys, his fingers are quite flat, especially towards the end of each of the scales, interestingly. And I actually don't think this is a massive technical issue. I don't think he's doing this because he plays with flat fingers. I think he's doing it because at the end of the scale, he's kind of pulling away from the notes. Maybe because he's thinking about where he needs to go next. You kind of want it to sound like you've arrived somewhere, which means sitting in on the note. Opposed to... But very nice work, and cracking out 3 hours a day of practice is pretty solid. I have no doubt that with that amount of practice, he's probably already solved these issues himself. Okay, next up we have Michael, and Michael has been playing for 1.5 years. He's been playing on and off, and he's finally found a piece that he really wants to perfect. So let's find out what that piece is. I love a bit of Guns N' Roses. I used to play Guns N' Roses on the guitar all the time. This is one of those songs that shows you how you can get such a great iconic song out of simplicity, because it's basically based around 3 chords. So you've got an F sharp major chord, a B major chord, an E major chord, and then it just goes back. And then you just stick the melody on top of it. So there's a couple of things that I would suggest for Michael to practice. The first one is around the timing, because I don't know whether he added the song afterwards or before, but it was falling out of time with the song. Either way, I would definitely still practice the timing, and you can kind of do that by practicing this to a metronome. But the second thing I would recommend practicing for this song in particular is different rhythm patterns, because if you don't have a solid rhythm pattern to play it on the piano that's going to keep you in time, then it is quite hard to stay in time. Now, interestingly, for Paradise City, obviously there is a lot of guitar involved, and it's a lot of rhythmic chordal playing, so we can kind of replicate that on the piano, and this is a pattern that I would probably use. So for an F sharp major chord, if you play the outer 2 notes of the F sharp major chord, an F sharp major chord is the notes F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp. So if we play an F sharp and a C sharp in the left hand, and then play the full chord F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp in the right hand, that gives us a good solid bass texture to work with. Then we can start building up the rhythm to sound like the song. And the way that I would do this is first by playing something like left, left, right. That almost replicates on the guitar like a down, down, up. Then you could do something like add a left, right on the end. So you get left, left, right, left, right. Then I would add just a right on its own. So you get left, left, right, left, right, right. Then something like the top note of the left, the bottom note of the left, the right, and then the bottom note of the left and the top note of the left. So you're kind of going 1, 2, right, 1, 2, and stick a right hand on the end. So together that would be left, left, right, left, right, right, left, left, right, left, left, right. And a bit quicker that would be. Then you can kind of repeat that for each of the chords. That's how I think about trying to replicate the song on the piano. When the melody comes in, what I would do to start with is just play 1 chord when the chords come in. If you do that, then you can focus on playing the melody to start with, so you might get something like this. And once you are completely comfortable with that, then you can start adding other chord notes in with the melody as well. So instead of playing, you might get... Then with the left hand, that would be like this. Breaking it down and practicing it like that, focusing on where the chords are, what the rhythm is, and then allowing yourself the space by just playing single chords to get the melody dead in time and build it up from there. That will make this a rock solid, pun intended, piano cover, especially if you practice it with a metronome as well to give you a strong pulse. But nice work and a very good choice of song. Okay, next up we have Vihaan. Vihaan? Not entirely sure how to pronounce that. But Vihaan is 9 years old and has been playing for about 4 months. And he's currently trying to learn the entirety of this piece. I mean, when I was 9 years old, I was probably rolling around in a field, getting covered in mud somewhere, never mind playing Moonlight Sonata Movement 3. Firstly, I've got to say, for 9 years old and only 4 weeks of practicing this piece, that is a pretty solid effort, and to be able to already play that much of it is pretty incredible. But I would probably suggest learning a few pieces that help with the techniques that are required for this piece. So for example, in the right hand, it's using 4-note broken chords. So let's say we have a C major chord, which is the notes C, E, and G. A broken chord is essentially where you play C, E, G, but then you play E, G, C. Then you play G, C, E, and then C, E, G, E, G, C, G, C, E, and so on. And in this case, for Moonlight Sonata Movement 3, this is a 4-note broken chord. So for the case of C major, once again, instead of playing just C, E, and G, we have the notes C, E, G, C, and then the chord is moved. So E, G, C, E, G, C, E, G, C, E, G, C, and so on. That is essentially the technique that is required for the opening of this piece. So I'd probably pick some pieces that are much easier that focus on that technique, because by doing that, by the time you come to learn this piece properly, your hand is already comfortable with the techniques needed to play it. So that's the first thing I would say. If you have aspirations of playing this kind of piece, then work on easier pieces that have certain techniques in it that are going to help you towards this certain piece. But if I could help with what he's actually already playing, the first thing that I would say is it's going to be really good to practice this much slower and make it really even, so you get something like this. It's really tempting to play it really fast because, let's be honest, it sounds super cool. But I would argue it sounds much more impressive if it sounds like you're not even trying. And it's actually not that difficult to get to the point where you don't have to try too hard. If you play it much slower, focusing on keeping your hand nice and relaxed, then it really doesn't take too much time at all to then build the speed up. For the section that's after that, which is this section, in the left hand, the top note has to kind of be joined up, because that's kind of part of the melody. And to do that, you have to make sure you use the right fingers when you're playing it. So once again, I would probably slow it right down so that you can really focus on getting the right fingers and making sure that that sounds like a melody. And super joined up, and then once again, it won't take very much to speed that back up again. But to be honest, any young player that is starting out because they love a piece and they're super interested in learning, I personally think that's great. And I remember attempting to learn many pieces that were super difficult when I was very young, because I was just excited to play something that sounded super impressive. Okay, next up we have Mikael, or is it another Michael, maybe? Maybe even Michal. I'm very sorry about butchering all of these names. Mikael is 38, and as a teenager, he was self-taught playing the guitar, but he lost motivation and started playing the piano 2 years ago. He used the app Piano Marvel to learn, and he first started on an unweighted 66-key keyboard. It feels like he's stuck at the level he's currently on, and he wants some help with which songs, etudes, technical exercises he should focus on. Very, very good and very solid playing. This is actually a super interesting case study because I actually see a lot of people get to this kind of level and feel like they plateau. And in my weekly newsletter, which is called Monday Music Tips, there's a link in the description if you want to join that. One of my weekly emails was about getting through that intermediate plateau. And usually people hit the intermediate plateau for two reasons. The first one is if you are a very technical player and you have done a lot of reading and you get to about grade 3, 4, 5 level, but at that point reading the notes, learning the piece of music and playing it on the piano is no longer enough. And the other circumstance is maybe you play by ear or maybe you do a lot of improvisation. That type of player reaches the intermediate plateau but in a very different way. And if, like in Michal's situation, where it sounds like he's gone down very much more of a traditional route, which is reading music, and maybe he's reached that grade 3, 4, 5 level intermediate plateau that way. For those people, it's best to try and start approaching music from a more emotional level rather than more of an analytical level. So for Mikael, I would probably suggest picking some pieces that are more emotionally driven rather than more technical based pieces where you're worrying about which fingers you're using, which notes you're playing, and you're just trying to learn from the start to the finish. The reason why that's the best way to go is for two reasons. One, if you start analysing music in that way, where you're trying to find a reason to play it in a certain way. Why does that melody sound so beautiful on top of those chords? Not only do you start to understand which chords you're playing on the page, which helps you read music much, much better because you're able to group large sections of notes rather than reading individual notes. But also your playing becomes much more emotional and your technique aids the emotion rather than more technical, and the emotion is something that takes a backseat. So for Mikael, I would probably recommend something like the Chopin Prelude in E minor. I would probably also recommend some of like Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words because you've got really clear melody, but I'd probably pick some of the easier ones. Also, there are lots of pieces by a lot of French composers that are of this kind of style, such as Debussy or Ravel. I mean, one of my absolute favourite pieces to listen to and to play is the second movement of Ravel's Piano Concerto. While this piece usually has an orchestra behind it, and later on in the piece of music, you probably require an orchestra in order for it to make sense. In the early part of this piece of music, it's so beautiful and it's got such clear chords in the left hand that I think that type of piece would make a massive difference. So for example, the key of the second movement is E major and the first chord is an E major chord, but the way that it's played just sounds so innocent, I want to say. And then you get this melody that comes in. Playing those kinds of pieces and not just playing them but sort of analysing them as well as to why it sounds the way it does is how you get through that intermediate plateau and move on to really thinking about music rather than the procedure of playing the piano. Okay, next up we have Flavio, and Flavio has been playing for 8 years with a 2-year break because he played guitar and bass. He started again at the age of 15 and since then he's been self-taught, and this is Un Sospiro, one of my absolute favourite pieces. Very nicely played. This is really not an easy piece. And Flavio is going through the problem that everyone who learns this piece will go through, which is trying to be accurate playing those crossing notes. Especially when it's in octaves. But mistakes like that are easily resolved with repetitive practice. But what I would say about this piece is the title of it is Un Sospiro, which means a sigh. And you can kind of hear that in the melody. It almost sounds like, ah. The question is it the type of sigh where you are like sad about something? Or is it the type of sigh like when you take your shoes off at the end of a day? At the moment, I would say it sounds like the type of sigh where you take your shoes off at the end of the day. And it's like a, ah. And I think it probably wants to sound like a, ah. Do you know what I mean? I don't think I've ever given such a clear explanation of something. But the way I would suggest turning this into more of a sad sigh is by using flexibility in the tempo. So this piece has got to flow, especially through these chord shapes. But it wants to sound like a wash of sound underneath the melody rather than hearing every distinct note. And that way the piece sounds a little bit less fluttery and more elongated rather than hearing all of this. And then you can shape the speed of what you're playing around the melody. So when the melody comes in, you get this. And usually with a melody like this, where it's a very clear phrase, you want to kind of taper off towards the end of the phrase. And you might want to push through the phrase just a little bit earlier on. When you do this and you use rubato to push and pull the melody like that while keeping those chords out the way, it almost makes this melody more conversational, like it's almost talking and saying something. Especially when you get moments like this. Moments like this where you're starting to get a resolution and you're getting like a very high note where the melody is leading up to something. You can create such impact by pushing and pulling and leading the music up to notes and moments like this in the piece of music. So a way that you can practice this without letting technique get in the way, because obviously this piece is very difficult to play physically, is to just play the melody by itself and think, if this was a melody on its own, how would you want to shape that melody in order to have the biggest impact? And then when you add all of the rest of the chords and the humming notes underneath, try to recreate that sound and let your technique facilitate the emotion rather than the emotion being limited by the technical difficulties of the piece. But once again, I absolutely love this piece and it's really not easy. And for Flavio to play this at this level, very, very commendable and very well played. Okay, next we have Megh, and Megh is from India. He's been learning to play for 2 years with a teacher and he started with playing the keyboard during lockdown. He joined an academy to start reading sheet music and learn how to play music properly, and he learned River Flows in You by watching YouTube without a metronome. He doesn't want to do grades, but he does want to work on his music theory as his mom and sir. Is that parents or teachers? Are constantly telling him that he's stalled that for a while. That sounds like a very parent thing to say. Very nice, and I very much like this song. So it sounds to me like it's based around kind of 4 chords, as with most pop songs. You've kind of got E flat major, and then F major, B flat major, then D minor, and then it just repeats. Except for at the end where you get, interestingly, an E flat major chord that goes to an E flat minor chord. It adds that extra little bit of sadness to it. So there's a couple of things that I would say to Megh, and the first one is about pedaling. Now, generally speaking, the rule for when to use the sustain pedal on the piano is when the chords change. And because this piece has 4 chords, you're probably going to change the pedal 4 times within those 4 chords. And the reason that you change it when the chords change is because if you hold a chord and then change the chord, you've still got all the notes held over from the previous chord and they sort of clash against each other. So by lifting the pedal up at that moment and putting it down again, then you clear those notes and you've kind of got a new bed of sound underneath the melody. Now, it sounds to me like Megh isn't repedaling when the chords change, although it could just be the ambience of the room. But if that is the case, then I would probably just practice playing the chords on their own and repedaling every time there's a new chord. And then adding the melody back in while doing that pedaling. The second thing that I would say, and this is entirely my preference, but it might be nice to hear some sort of thicker and thinner moments within the song to give it a bit more shape. Now, Megh could have read this off sheet music and then be playing a sheet music version of it, which is cool, but as a pianist, you have the option to mess around with it. So you could do something like make it much lighter in the verse and then thicken it up for the chorus, something like... Something like that, where there's a little bit more contrast between the certain sections within the song, but that is entirely my preference in order to keep my small brain interested. You can, of course, when making your own version of piano arrangements, play it exactly how you want to play it. As ever, if you want to send me your piano playing, then you can do that with a link in the description. And if you want to see my reaction to more of my subscribers playing, then head on through and I will see you there.